Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this intriguing webinar on understanding human rights in modern India and future prospects. I'm Anupama Sharma, faculty at Jindal Global Law School and director of the arts programs. We have two highly respected professionals joining us today, Professor Raja Bagga and Professor Joshika Saraf. Professor Raja Bagga is a clinical lecturer of law and assistant director at the Criminal Justice Clinic at Jindal Global Law School. He has completed his LLB from Faculty of Law, Delhi University after a bachelor's degree in economics. Subsequently, he received an MSc in Criminal Justice Policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science as a Chevening Scholar. Professor Bagga has worked for more than 8 years at the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, also known as CHRI, in India and London on access to justice issues. His areas of work include prison reforms, police accountability, and access to legal aid for persons in custody. Professor Bagga has conducted national and Commonwealth-wide research on various human rights issues and worked with state institutions, human rights commissions, and legal aid bodies. His work has been presented before the Parliament and the Supreme Court of India. Welcome, Professor Bagga, to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Joshika Saraf is an assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School. She obtained her BA LLB honors degree from JGLS in 2017. She went to work as a law researcher at the High Court of Delhi before moving to London to earn her LLM from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London, with a focus on human rights, conflict, and justice. At SOAS, she was elected as the student representative of the 2018-19 batch of LLM cohort and also the event coordinator for the SOAS UN Society. Professor Saraf has worked on prominent cases such as the Nirbhaya gang rape case, amongst many others. She has also worked with the United Nations, Indian Ministry of Home Affairs, and New Delhi Municipal Council. Thank you, Joshika Saraf, for joining us today, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ms. Apurvi Jha, who is a lecturer at Jindal Global Law School and Assistant Dean for the Arts Programs, will be moderating today's session. Over to you, Apurvi.
Thank you so much, Anupama ma'am. And thank you so much, Professor Raja and Professor Joshika, for accommodating us for the day. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for finding time and attending today's webinar. I will quickly go through some points to note so we all have a seamless webinar experience. In order not to disturb the course of the webinar, please communicate only via the chat box. After our panelists discuss different aspects of human rights and the role of human rights practitioners, we will open the floor for some questions from the attendees. I request you to kindly post your questions only on the chat box during the course of the talk, and then eventually I will communicate them and forward it to the panelists. It's great that we can all meet today to explore the various facets of human rights. There are two bundles of rights that every human is awarded with. One is of civil and political rights, and the other consists of socio-cultural and socio-economic rights. In continuation with this understanding, I would like to invite Professor Raja to discuss the first bundle of rights involving civil and political rights and share some case studies on these topics.
Thanks, Professor Apurvi. I'll wait for you to just upload the presentation and then we can start.
Yes, sir. I request the IT team to please grant me the required co-host.
While we address the technicalities, I'll just take the opportunity to thank Professor Anupama for introducing us. I'm also glad that given this is a Sunday evening, we still have a lot of participants here, attendees here. And I look forward to discussing what we have in store today, and also looking forward to an interactive session where there are questions and we can just have conversations around it. Great. Thank you. Okay, I think we can start from the next slide. Yeah. Yeah. So, as Professor Apuvi mentioned, we are talking about different facets of human rights today, uh, which includes civil and political rights. And later on, we have Professor Joshika, which would be talking about economic, social, and cultural rights as well. Now, just to quickly let you know what I intend to cover today, or what we intend to discuss today. One is what are civil and political rights, to give a snapshot, because they embody or they cover huge sets of rights which cannot be actually encapsulated in 20 minutes. So we'll just have a snapshot of these rights. Then my intent is to talk about the relationship between these international standards and rights, and look at how they've percolated in domestic law. I think it is important for us to recognize that these human rights are not abstract conceptions, but they find value, or they find relevance in our everyday lives, in how we interact with each other, in how we operate, in how we work, in how we communicate with each other, and therefore to recognize that these are crucial for us to understand, not as just some international standards, but as something which regulates our everyday life. And third aspect that I would want to cover is to recognize that while these rights exist, they are usually violated, and therefore, what is the role of those who read, who learn, who work on human rights? How can we all work together to reduce the possibility of these violations? So that would be the intent of my presentation for today. The next slide, please. So what are civil and political rights? Now, as I mentioned, there are human rights have been sort of segregated or classified into different generations of rights. The first generation of rights is understood as civil and political rights. The second generation as economic, social, and cultural rights, which, as I mentioned, Professor Joshika will cover. And the third generation, which looks at solidarity or group rights. So therefore, looking at rights to sustainable development, to peace, to a healthy environment. So these are the generation of rights, and I'll be talking about the first one, which is civil and political rights. Next slide, please. So to introduce what are civil and political rights, what do they mean? Now, they are a class of rights, they're a bundle of rights that protect individuals and individuals' freedom. So the objective of these rights is to protect freedom. Now, who do we protect this freedom from? Who is taking away these freedoms? So these freedoms need to be protected from infringements, be it by the government, be it by organizations, or be it by private individuals. So the objective of having civil political rights is to protect these freedoms from these bodies or these individuals. Now, what would that lead to? Now, the objective of ensuring or actualizing civil and political rights is to ensure that we all as individuals can participate in civil and political life without any discrimination, without any repression. And this is why usually civil and political rights are understood as negative rights. So here, to ensure that we have civil and political rights, the government does not have to affirm or provide resources to actualize, but actually has to step back to refrain from taking those rights away. So, for example, if my right not to be discriminated on the basis of my caste, my gender, my religion, my disability. Now, that is so. What the objective of these rights is that the government does not take it away, and therefore it is understood as negative rights compared to positive rights, which Professor Joshika will later talk about. Now, where do we find these rights? What are the sources of these rights? Now, the most important international documents or instruments that have laid down these rights are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which lists down important principles with respect to both civil and political rights as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. And then a couple of decades later, we had the International Covenant on civil and political rights. Going forward, for the ease, I will be referring to them as ICCPR. But again, with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they laid down important safeguards, important principles and guidelines which are relevant to enjoy basic freedoms. So that's the frame that we are looking at. Now, to reduce the abstractness of these rights, I'll give examples of what these rights can mean in the next slide. Now, as I said, civil political rights, to ensure that one has a meaningful life where you can enjoy basic freedoms, it would require different aspects to be considered. And so I'm looking at only some of them. Firstly, to ensure that people have the physical and mental integrity, life and safety. So the basic right to life, the basic right to life with dignity, the basic right to life where your physical and mental faculties are respected, your rights are not taken away. That is something that civil and political rights ensure. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is the right to protection from discrimination. And this discrimination can be on the basis of gender, gender orientation, sexual orientation, caste, nationality, ethnicity, and others. And again, if these are violated, and these are violated both in the private and the public sphere, then your civil rights are being violated, and therefore there should be a remedy if you are discriminated against based on any of these markers. Another important civil and political right are these individual rights to privacy. So all these basic rights that we take for granted, right, right to privacy, right to freedom of thought, to speech, expression, right to follow a particular faith or religion, right to press, all of these fundamental basic rights are in some civil and political rights, correct? Another important aspect of rights that I have been working on for a very long period now is looking at rights relating to natural justice. So for example, so basically looking at fair trial. Now, if I'm an accused or if I'm a victim, if I'm an arrestee, what rights, what fair trial rights do I have? For example, the right to be produced in court, the right for my defense to be heard by the court before making a decision, the right to get bail if my custody is not as important, the right to seek a legal remedy. All of these rights are fair trial or due process rights, and again they form a part of civil and political rights. Another bundle of rights or another classification of rights are rights from the protection of slavery or involuntary servitude, rights against torture or cruel and inhuman treatment. Now, when we look at the right to slavery, for example, we recognize that while slavery in the form in which we understand it existed 100 or 200 years ago may not exist currently, but there is growing work on contemporary forms of slavery, looking at forced labor, looking at child labor, looking at other aspects of which replicate the forms in which slavery existed, and the right to not be forced into such activities, the right to be protected against torture, all of them form an important part of civil and political rights. And the last form of rights, where one is which relates to freedom to form associations, freedom, having the right to assemble, the right to vote, the right to participate in the political arena, to be able to have elections where one has the right to decide who would be our representatives. All of these come under civil and political rights. Now, what is important to recognize is that while there are multiple rights that I have discussed, these rights do form a place either in the form of constitutional rights. So constitutional right is a right which is laid down in the constitution, or these can be found as statutory rights. So if there is a particular law which has been passed, a particular procedure that has been followed, and these rights are reflected there, then they are called statutory rights. Next slide, please. Among all the rights that I talked about currently, uh, they are foundational rights. They're important for a human being to meaningfully participate in society, right? But are all of these rights equal, or are they at an equal footing, or are there hierarchy of rights? Now, there is often this contestation in terms of whether civil and political rights are more important, or economic, social, and cultural rights, or within, for example, civil and political rights, are some rights more important or not? Now, usually the way one addresses this is to say that all human rights are universal, they are indivisible. At the same time, they're interdependent, right? One right correlates to the other, and therefore they're interdependent and related. And therefore, it is difficult to sort of create a hierarchy and see which rights are important. Having said that, it is also important to recognize that rights to life and personal liberty forms the crux, forms sort of the center, which therefore has impacts on other rights. So if these rights are taken away, then sort of actualization of other rights become meaningless. And therefore, in that context, I thought it'd be important to discuss this with all of you. Next slide, please. So, as I was saying earlier, so the UDHR is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it as an instrument, it talks about principles. It's a declaratory statement, and therefore it recognizes that every person has the right to life, liberty, and security. Right now, the ICCPR it goes further, and it explains this right and says that while every human being has an inherent right to life, uh, it cannot be it should not be arbitrarily deprived. So what the ICCPR is trying to say is that while these rights are important, they can be taken away, but not arbitrarily. There has to be a procedure to it. And when we see that in our local or domestic context, there is the most fundamental article, which is Article 21, which talks about how and I'm just going to state it: no person shall be deprived of their life or personal liberty except according to a procedure established by law. So, following the ICCPR, what the Indian Constitution is guaranteeing, that your right to life, right to liberty is sacrosanct, it is important. It can only be taken away if there is a procedure established. Now, through the multiple decades, what the courts have done is to explain this right, given the importance of it. And there are two important elements here. Uh, First is to look at the right to personal liberty. Now, as I said, can my personal liberty be taken away just because there is a procedure? So if can I just be arrested tomorrow without any framework involved? No, I cannot. There has to be a procedure which must be fair, which must be reasonable, which cannot be arbitrary. So, so therefore, in India, we have specific laws which govern what kind of offenses, what is crime, and also what is the punishment for the crime. Also, there are procedural laws which talk about how, if I'm suspected of committing a crime, how can I be arrested? How can a trial go against me? And then, so therefore, unless these procedures are not followed, my liberty cannot be taken away. And therefore, this is important. The other aspect of this is that right to life does not mean mere living existence. It does not merely exist that mean protection of limbs or mental faculties, but also right to life means right to life is dignity. And so what the courts have talked about, have in their judgments, is that right to life with dignity means also right to privacy, right against torture, how to regulate solitary confinement, how to regulate handcuffing of prisoners, but also looking at a completely different aspect of how right to life with dignity includes adequate nutrition, clothing, or shelter. So therefore, what the courts and the legislatures try to do is to give this very important right as much of a broader meaning as possible. Next slide, please. Now, I was just talking about the importance of right to life. However, it is it is common to see how this very important, critical, crucial right is violated on an everyday basis. And therefore, which is what I want to talk about now. How do we see violations of this right to life in context of custodial violence and custodial death? I'm sure most of you, either through actual incidents, through movies, through news articles, would have come across cases where there are police excesses, and be it in the streets or inside police stations. I'm sure you would have read about it. Now, how do we reconcile this while we have this framework where it's structured, and then we also see these everyday violence? Next slide. So just to give you a snapshot of what we are talking about when we say custodial violence, in the last 3 years, this is according to the official data, the National Human Rights Commissions have received about 1,200 cases of torture in police custody, which means more than one complaint of torture in custody every single day. So this is the and this is just the cases which have reached the commissions. So the possibility of, or the quantum of this problem can be much higher. Almost thousand people have died in police custody in the last 10 years, and majority of them have died within 24 hours of their interaction or of their arrest with the police. Now, a person who's hale and hearty is arrested by the police and within 24 hours dies. This clearly shows that there is clearly something wrong with respect to how the policing takes place and the accountability for it. And we also noticed that majority of these deaths are taking place in only 3 states: Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, and Gujarat. The objective of giving a snapshot is to recognize that while we heal and we recognize the importance of right to life, the violations, unfortunately, are very common. Next slide. I'm sure most of you might be familiar with these faces. This is Jairaj and Benix. Jairaj was 59 years old and Benix 31 years old in 2020. In June 2020, during the COVID lockdown, both of them died within a space of 1 day in June. This case was talked about extensively in the media. So I'll just very quickly give you a brief of what happened in this case. Now, according to the police, both Jairaj and Benix, they had a mobile store, and they allegedly had not shut their store as per the COVID guidelines. The police officers picked up the father, Jairaj. When the son was informed that there was picked up, he went to the Satakulam police station, where then both of them were detained, were beaten up for almost a day. They were also sexually assaulted, which eventually led to their death. Now, while the outrage around the death went on for a year, in fact, the proceedings of the case are going on, we've constantly seen that more of such deaths are taking place. Now, what I want to talk about is what human rights or what standards existed which could have prevented this death, but which were laid down, and what really happened in this case for us to recognize what as human rights practitioners can do. Next slide, please. Now, there are multiple rights that can be talked about for an arrestee, but I'm just sticking to some of them right now. The rights against unreasonable arrest. Now, this is something which has been laid down by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by the ICCPR, and also very much crystallized in our domestic law in India. The law very clearly lays down that an individual cannot just be arbitrarily arrested. There have to be specific reasons for these arrests. The police have to explain if there is a clear evidence against the arrest. And in fact, in this case, when the CBI later took up the case, they said that actually Jairaj and Benix had not violated lockdown norms even. But even if they did that really require an arrest of these individuals, right? Secondly, an important right is the right to legal representation. Again, this is a constitutional right under Article 22, which says that if you are a person in custody, you have the right to have a lawyer next to you during interrogation. Now, I'm sure most of you, again, through movies, through news stories, would have heard how interrogation in India takes place, what kind of practices are used. And so, therefore, the law provides that when this interrogation takes place, you should have a lawyer which will protect you. Now, in this specific case, Jairaj and Benix's lawyer were actually outside the police station, but they weren't even allowed to enter. So while the obligation in law is that the police should call a lawyer if a person does not have one, here the lawyer was outside the police station and they were not allowed to enter, right? And so therefore we see how these violations. Another important component while looking at arrests and how we could have addressed the violence and torture that took place with Jairaj and Benix was the right to medical examination. Now, this might be disturbing for some, but as the facts of the case go, in the one day that they were at the police station, their lungis were actually changed 6 times. This is the amount of blood that the blood loss that they had faced. But the medical examination that took place for Jairaj and Benix mentioned that there were no injuries on their body. Right now, from media reports, what we know that they barely could walk. However, the medical examinations completely ignored any of that for reasons that we all are aware of. I hope. Another important right that could have helped avoid the death of Jairaj and Benix and others is their right to be produced in front of the magistrate. Now, to ensure that when somebody is arrested, are there reasonable grounds for them to be arrested? The law provides that within 24 hours, the police have to produce this individual in front of a magistrate. Now, in Jairaj and Benix's case, again, were they produced? Yes, they were produced. However, the magistrate was too busy to actually, they were not present in court. So Jairaj and Benix were actually taken to the magistrate's home, and the magistrate from a I think 3rd or the 4th floor just waved and said, yes, custody granted. A magistrate should have actually physically observed and should have taken a note of whether these individuals are medically fit or not, have they been violated or not, but the magistrate chose not to. Now, all of these different rights which exist both as under international human rights standards as well as in domestic law were violated. And all of these together, sort of breaking down of all of these rights, led to the deaths of Jairaj Benix and 1,000 others in the last decade. Now, this makes our work both important and relevant. And I'll finish with the last slide, which is, Purvi, can have the last slide? Actually, the slide later, next one. What can human rights practitioners do? And here I have only discussed a very specific aspect of a very specific right, which is the right to life. So therefore, what I'm going to talk about is specific to this, but it also has replication or applicability in other situations. Now, as lawyers or as human rights lawyers, we need to ensure what we need to ensure is the fact that usually the police get away with these violations. How do we ensure accountability? So therefore, we need human rights lawyers who therefore recognize that the everyday violation and then take up these cases, because usually the violence is meted out by people who cannot afford good lawyers or competent lawyers. And therefore, how do we ensure as human rights lawyers that we take these cases with as our primary job to ensure that the perpetrators do not get away with murder? As journalists, now a lot of my work in the last decade has also has led to a lot of conversations on work with journalists to ensure that they are aware of what human rights violations exist, what rights are available, so that there is enough reporting of of what gaps exist in the framework. Now, this again is crucial to ensure that the public is aware of violations, and B, that there's a possibility of accountability because the public knows what the perpetrators are doing. As human rights activists, there are multiple roles that human rights activists can take. A is to ensure that the families of those who've been violated, how do we ensure that there is financial, psychological, mental support that they need, and also to work with families, to work with people who have faced violations, so that they have the option to fight the system and to get redressal for their violations. Similarly, as civil society organizations and academics, it is crucial for them to identify and document patterns of violence, patterns of human rights violations, to ensure that one recognizes the methods in which these gaps exist, and also to recognize if there are good practices that specific state actors are following, so that through research, through advocacy, one can again prevent or reduce such violations, especially for violations which are as crucial as extinguishing the right to life. So I'll stop here. I hope I have not taken a lot of time, and I'll request Professor Joshika to continue.
Thank you so much, Professor Raja, for this intriguing session and discussion. We recognize the importance of defending human rights issues given the systematic challenges that we have just come across. And with this now, I would request Professor Joshika to take it forward and share her valued insights on the second bundle of rights as enshrined under the ambit of human rights.
Thank you, Purvi. Can I please have the same presentation that Raja was using?
Yes, if you want, you can share it yourself. If you want, I can also do it.
Please share and I'll just let you know. Thank you, Raja. That was great. I think it has given me a lot of idea how to go ahead with my part. So we'll start with where Raja left. Now, while the presentation is okay, so just the next slide. Okay, great. So what I'll be looking at are the economic, social, cultural rights, and this is something that you must have come across a lot of times, but it's something which is categorized, and that is what we're going to focus on. Now, these are socio-economic human rights, and they include a number of rights, which include the right to education, right to housing, right to educate, standard of living, right to health, victims' right, and the right to science and culture, right? Now, they are a type of human rights that guarantee us the conditions that we need to live a life of dignity, where everyone can achieve well-being and they can realize their potential and they have the opportunity to find happiness and fulfillment. Now, as Raja has already mentioned, human rights are basically a multidimensional concept. And when you see it from a moral claim perspective, right? So human rights, they give force to universal values such as dignity, equity, and justice. And they assert that there are certain needs, including material needs, that are so essential for human beings to flourish that they must be guaranteed to all. Now, as political demands, which is the other way to look at human rights basically argue for people's well-being to be prioritized when making certain hard choices, and especially around how policies should be designed and how resources should be distributed, right? And when we look at the same concept of human rights from a legal perspective, right? So there are certain obligations which flows from international treaties, national constitutions, and other varied legislations. And human rights actually call for compliance with these rules, and there is some sort of accountability which needs to be rendered if these rules are broken, right? And for these reasons, it's very important to recognize economic, social, and cultural rights as human rights, because they highlight that poverty and inequality are neither inevitable nor natural, right? Now, these rights, the ESCR, which is the economic, social, and cultural rights, they are recognized and protected in a number of international and regional human rights instruments. Like Raja has already discussed, where the civil and political rights lie, and I'm going to talk about where the economic, social, and cultural rights lie. Now, it's very important to understand that all the member states to all these treaties, they have a legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill these rights, and they're expected to take progressive action towards their fulfillment. Now, just like civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights are also a part of the body of international human rights law, like Apurvi had mentioned. And this means that they also give individuals legitimate claims against state and non-state actors when they fail to uphold the protections and entitlement that these rights guarantee. Now, both these rights, like these two categories of rights, they are deeply intertwined. So let me give you some examples for you to understand it better. Now, the right to speak freely, if you think of it, like, if a person wants to speak freely, that person can only do so and can do so meaningfully if, that person have had some sort of basic education, right? So this is how these two rights are intertwined. Another example is, if you have this right to vote, it may mean a little to you if you're starving or suffering from poverty, or if you are starving. Now, similarly, the right to decent work, right, may be impossible to enjoy if you're not allowed to meet and assemble in groups to discuss work conditions. So as we can see, both these two generations of rights that we are covering today, they are intertwined and they cannot be like really separated from each other's. Now, can I please request for the change of slide? Thank you. Now, there are different international treaties that recognize these rights. Raja has already mentioned some of them, and I'll be taking some of them forward. So, of course, we know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. Next, we have the International Covenant on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is essentially the primary international legal source for economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, coming from these two primary documents, we of course have a number of documents, and I've highlighted four treaties here in red. The first one is the Convention on the Rights of Child, and the other one is Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is CRC and CEDAW. Now, what these two documents, these two treaties, they do is that they recognize and protect many of the economic, social, and cultural rights as recognized by the ICSCR, which is our primary legal document, in relation to children and women. And this is one of the things that we're going to cover, in my presentation further. The next is CERD, which is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The next slide, Apurvi, the same slide with all the, yeah. So this basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of racial or ethnic origin in relation to a number of ESC rights. Now, the last one is the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is CRPD, and it also prohibits all discrimination on the basis of disability, including refusal of the reasonable accommodation relating to full enjoyment of these rights, right? So I hope I'm clear now with a basic idea of what these rights essentially are. Now, for the purpose of this webinar and the time that we have, we're going to just focus on one particular thing now, like one particular ambit of rights. And this is the right to health. And as Professor Raja has already mentioned, the whole idea behind right to life with dignity and personal liberty, what I am going to do is I'm going to take it forward, this particular right to life, take it forward and put it within the ambit of right to health. And we are going to focus on young girls and women's right to reproductive and sexual rights. Apurvi, next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so we are going to look at Srhr, which is essentially sexual and reproductive health rights, right? And it comes within the right to health. As we had discussed, earlier, like just a few minutes back, that right to health forms a very important part of this particular group of rights that, I'm covering. So this is what we're going to talk about. Now, I'm not sure if you've heard of this particular category of rights, but sexual and reproductive health rights are basically fundamental human rights, and they include issues like abortion, HIV, and other sexually transmitted infections, maternal health and rights, contraceptive access, gender-based violence, discrimination and stigma, and many more such things. Now, they're related to multiple human rights, including the right to life, right to be free from torture, the right to health, the right to privacy, the right to education, and the prohibition of discrimination. So like I mentioned, all these rights are intertwined, and just this one right to health, which we're not looking at the entire right to health, we're just looking at Srhr. Now they cover so many different rights, like I just mentioned, an array of rights. Now the Committee of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which we have just discussed, and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is Srhr, they have both clearly indicated that women's right to health includes their sexual and reproductive health. And since these treaties include this particular right, their states by default, they have an obligation to respect, protect and fulfill rights related to women's sexual and reproductive health. Now, I'm sure a lot of you must have had not heard of these things, because it's a concept when we're talking about sexual and reproductive health rights. It's a concept that Indians and mostly South Asians, they are largely ignorant and aloof about. Now, there are a lot of taboos and there are a lot of cultural biases around topics like sex and sexuality. And this is the root cause for many issues people, especially young girls, like really young girls and women, they face on a daily basis. There are patriarchal concepts of women's roles within the family, which mean that women are often valued based on their ability to reproduce. There are early marriages and pregnancies, or there are repeated pregnancy, which is spaced too closely together, often as a result of efforts to produce a male offspring. This entire ideology of having a male child. Moving on, it has like this preference for sons, and a lot of other impact that this particular thing has, this patriarchal mindset that the impact that it has on women's body. It results it results in a very devastating impact on women's health, and it has a lot of fatal consequences as well. Now, women are also blamed for infertility. They suffer a lot of ostracization, and they're also subjected to various human rights violations as a result of the same. Now, when we talk about these violation of rights, how Srhr is violated. Before coming to that, I would just like you to look at the pictures that I put on this slide, which has, protests from different part of the countries, different part of the world. Like there's of course US, there's some from Argentina, and there is one from India which says Abbas, my body, my rights. So there are a lot of protests which are happening, on a regular basis regarding the violation of sexual and reproductive health rights when it comes to the women specifically and young girls. And we also know, I don't know how many of you are following the news where the US Supreme Court is sort of planning to overturn Roe v. Wade judgment, which is one of the major judgment which lets pregnant woman get her pregnancy terminated, like she gets a right abortion, but they're planning to overturn that judgment. So that's something on the side as to what is happening in the world and why are there so many protests on this slide particularly. Now, of course, these rights are violated on a daily basis, and we are going to just talk about India from here on. So there is a 2019 report by the Family Planning Association of India, where it's actually, they got to know that 14% of pregnancies amongst women who are aged under 20, they are unplanned. Can we please go to the next slide? Yeah, so as you can see, it says 78% of 15 million abortions that happen in the country, they take place outside medical facilities. So that essentially means that women and young girls, they can't really go to hospitals, they can't really go to medical facilities and get their pregnancies terminated. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as you can see here, over 30 million married women and 2 million adolescent women, they lack access to contemporary contraceptive. Like they don't have access to any kind of contraceptives, or especially the contemporary ones, even in the year 2022. There are some more facts. Like for example, there are 78% of abortions which are performed when they're performed in adolescents, which are like young girls. They are unsafe and they actually put them at a risk of complications. Now, a lot of people, they do not receive the treatment that they require after they get an abortion. furthermore, there are 34% of adolescent married girls who are, physically, emotionally, or sexually assaulted, and 50% of maternal deaths among girls from 15 to 19 years of age, they occur due to unsafe abortion practices. Now, as you can see, these statistics are so crucial, and still we are living in a scenario where sexual and reproductive health is not even a category that has its own, laws and medical courses. So a lot of colleges, like medical colleges, and a lot of courses that we study, it will not talk about, sexual and reproductive health rights, which is why it's so problematic, and still a lot of women and young girls are dying and their right to health is essentially violated, right? Now, despite these obligations, as we had discussed, a lot of states have an obligation under these international treaties, to look to respect and fulfill and to realize these basic fundamental rights. Still, a lot of violation of women's sexual and reproductive health rights happen, and they are very frequent, and there are different forms. So first, there can be denial of access to service that only women require. So there is some sort of discrimination on the basis of the fact that they are women. So there's gender-based discrimination. There's, of course, poor quality of services. So you can't always, although women and young girls are entitled to get the best services that are out there, but still they get like poor quality services, which affects them in the long term, or some of them actually die. There are a lot of case laws. There are a lot of newspaper reports that you're going to read on a daily basis, which would have something about a young girl dying due to some complications in her pregnancy, or a married woman dying due to these complications itself. Now, of course, such violations would also have consequences such as, forced sterilizations, forced examinations, virginity examinations, forced abortion without the women's prior consent, just because they have realized that it's a female fetus. There is female genital mutilation as one of the reasons, one of the forms that it can take, like such violations can take, and of course early marriage. So these are various issues that we can face, that can come up due to violations of sexual and reproductive health rights. Now, what is it that we're looking at here now? Can we please change the slide? Yeah, thank you. So we are looking at, there are certain set of rights that young girls and women are entitled to, but those rights are violated very frequently, and because of these systemic violations, there is an impact on the right to life of these young girls and women. That they're dying. They don't have access to a lot of services that they're entitled to. Now, there are a lot of social, cultural, and economic barriers, like we have discussed. There is this taboo. There are, of course, certain cultural biases. People are not able to afford certain, like these are like financial, economic barriers. And, of course, so culture, traditions is something that also the patriarchal mindset that sort of restricts, young girls and women to access these services. But due to these barriers, it is also important to understand that there is an urgent need for alternate forums, right, to provide judgment-free and accurate knowledge. So there's no judgment, and there is accurate knowledge, and people from all walks of life must have access to accurate information and safe, effective, affordable, and acceptable contraceptive methods to their choice. Now, when we're talking about couples, a lot of women, especially women, they must have access to clinical services to aid healthy pregnancies. They must receive adequate information and services helping them conceive and carry the pregnancy to full term. Further, everyone, like literally everyone, must have information and ability to protect themselves from sexually transmitted infections and screening and management when it comes to cancer. There is a further need to include a wider range of topics such as reproductive health, menstrual hygiene, sexual health, sexuality and relation to HIV and other sexually transmitted, infections in curriculum, be it in school or be it in colleges. And, there should be some sort of programming which uses non-traditional platforms such as social media and local language, which is actually friendly, like local, even, chatbots, which are friendly and which are sensitive to this particular notion. Now, we have understood as to what the problem is. We have identified that this is the problem, and we have also seen what is the need of the hour. Now, what is the role of human rights practitioners, when we talk about like these different, as lawyers, as journalists, be it activists, civil society organization, as academics, like Professor Raja, like Apurvi, Anupama, or I, like as academics, what is it that we can do, or as simply as citizens, what is it that you can do when it comes to providing certain these rights that are violated? How is it that you can create awareness? How is it that you can provide for certain change in policy? So there are a lot of things that we're going to discuss in our next section, which talks about the future career prospects. But I can tell you that like the core thing that we're dealing with here, like the sexual and reproductive health rights, is the part where there is an urgent need to have access, like unrestricted access to information to all young girls and women and people at large, to create awareness about these rights, and also to give certain resources and services which will not which will which will help minimize the kind of effect that these otherwise violations do. So that would be all from my side, and I would be happy to take questions regarding the presentation.
So much, Professor Joshika, for such an exciting and intriguing presentation. Before we move to the next segment, we do have a couple of questions asked by the attendees. So let me just go through these real quickly. So one of the anonymous attendees have asked a question to either of the speakers or both of them, which is that, what do you think is the reason for the state's apathy towards protecting these rights like SRHR?
Raja, would you like me to go ahead and then maybe you can follow?
I mean, if you want to first talk about the SRHR bit, and then I can sort of.
Yeah, I can most definitely. So I think, in relation to SRHR particularly, I think this is these sets of rights are very controversial anyway to begin with. This is something that people are not really okay with discussing. I see a lot of my like we teach, right? So I see a lot of my students who are not comfortable having conversations around issues like this. So I think it also depends on the kind of culture, the kind of society that you're coming from, due to which there is some sort of apprehension even for the government or certain policies to change. And it takes time, like they always say that traditions and culture, it takes time to come up with anything which is as open as, like, say, SRHR. Although these are very basic fundamental human rights, but it's also important to understand that we come from a country that has diverse cultures and ideology. So it's very difficult to come up with something that would make everyone happy. And I also feel that is why it takes a lot of time, but that is precisely where human rights practitioners, be it in form of advocacy or be it in form of a lot of different ways, can come in the picture and actually help, creating that difference that we're looking at. Raja?
I think specifically with the aspect that I usually deal with, which is with respect to prisons and policing, the answer is a bit complex because we also need to recognize that state's apathy or lack of it also comes from what are their priorities. Usually, persons in custody or who are understood to be criminals usually is not the priority of the state. One. Secondly, it's also important to recognize that policing, for example, is understood as an important arm of the government, though there should be a separation of powers. However, what we recognize is that there is the existing culture of impunity, which the state usually chooses not to address, because that will also have implications on them because of how these powers are muddled. So therefore, a lack of priority and resources. So what is one thing that we recognize with our work and research on civil and political rights is that it does require a lot of infrastructural requirement. And what we have noticed over decades is, be it with respect to, say, looking at prisons and the need for medical health medical providers, or basic needs like food, sanitation, water. All of these are resource intensive, and the choice of the government to be able to address that vis-a-vis other things which might be politically more useful. So we need to recognize that these rights also are in the context of what are the choices of the preferences and of the state, and uh, also the recognition of what the society or citizens believe is important, right? So unless we have the understanding in the public domain that these civil rights are important, one cannot expect the government to be able to be more empathetic about it. Yeah, that's the short answer.
Thank you, sir. We do have few more questions in the chat box. Kritika has asked, what can be done to help spread SRHR knowledge to people? I think this one is addressed to Joshika.
Yeah, thank you, Kritika. I think that's a very interesting question. I think that is something that we get a lot whenever we are teaching about this. And I think I would like to cover it in the next section, which talks about career prospects when it comes to human rights. But to tell you briefly, I have worked with various organizations earlier, and I've also worked as an advocacy person for an organization that works around these rights. So, it's always beneficial to talk to a lot of stakeholders. And I actually want to highlight it in the next section, but you can actually talk to a lot of stakeholders. You can create awareness by simply getting in touch with organizations who are looking for volunteers. You can do a lot of advocacy work. So just hang in there for the next section to begin. I would be more than happy to help you with it.
Kritika has another question as well. She asks, do you think people exploit the rights provided to them? If so, how can we prevent it?
Could you repeat that question again, please, Apuvi?
So, do you think people exploit the rights provided to them? If so, how can we prevent them?
Interesting question. So I think it's also relatively abstract because there are different kinds of rights which have different kinds of implications. We need to recognize that we are here talking about basic human rights, which should be accorded to everyone, and therefore exploitation of a right. And the fact that most of these rights are actually not even provided to individuals. So I don't think we're at a stage where the issue is exploitation, but just guaranteeing these rights would be important. If there's a specific example about exploitation, I might be able to sort of address that better, I think. So if Kritika, you have that. Joshika, do you want to add to that?
Okay, sorry, I was on mute. No, I understand the part where, you said that an example would be great. So I think if you can have an example, maybe we can try to put it in some context. Because of course, if you're given a right, there is always that element of it being misused. And that is why, although a lot of rights, people think of coming up with such rights to benefit people at large, but due to certain precedents, people, like especially the courts, for example, they have their they restrict from coming up with certain freedoms and liberties because there is a history of those rights being misused. So yes, that is what I want to add. But yeah, an example would be great, and maybe we can then use that example to go ahead.
Thank you so much, panelists. I think we also have one more question by Aniruddha. I believe, Professor Joshika, if you can start with the answer on this. So he says, there seem to be lots of human rights violations happening these days. Excessive use of bulldozers, misuse of sedition law, etc. Have governments always been like this, or have such instances increased in recent times?
Okay, that's an interesting question, to be honest, because we all of us wonder a lot of things, and it's great that you're actually thinking about what is happening in today's time, because I've seen a lot of people who are indifferent to everything that's happening. But to be honest, I feel I personally feel that it's not about a lot of incidents being happening or a lot of retaliation being coming from the government side. It's more about how one thing has taken its own course, in due time. So that is how measures, I think, are being taken by both the sides. So I would not say that it's one person's or one side's fault to come up with the measures or come up with the solutions that they're actually coming up with, or the kind of retaliations that that they have. It also largely depends on what is the current situation, what is the need of the hour. So it's very important to see both the sides, right? So as lawyers, so we are all lawyers by profession, right? So as lawyers, are always taught to look at both the sides before coming to any conclusion. So I feel it's also important, if you're looking at what one side is doing. So for example, according to your question, you're looking at what the government is doing. There are certain retaliatory measures which might seem too excessive to people, but when you're asking something like this, I think it's very important to understand and maybe think about it by yourself as to what actually called for such a reaction, right? What was the action in the first place due to which such a reaction actually happened? And if then by your own judgment it feels that it was not okay, it was actually a human rights violation, then we can of course take the conversation further. But I think, yeah, this is what I feel like. This is like the prima facie reaction that I would have, or my plan of action would be to, if I'm looking at a thing like this. Raja, would you like to add?
Sure, thanks. So I think public memory is short. And while when we're looking at sedition, bulldozers, one can understand how it can be troubling to see the kind of violations that are taking place. But we also need to recognize that, unfortunately, in this country, we've seen violations taking place over decades. For example, if we see, say, the UAPA being used, we also recognize this previous governments had actually also initiated it and used it. Similarly, there are other laws so this is not a recent phenomenon. We've seen emergency, we've seen the kind of violations that have taken place over the years, specifically with particular communities. So while we recognize that certain form of violations might be happening now, but with respect to violations, with respect to Dalits, Adivasis, other minorities, these violations and violence have been taking place for decades. And therefore, it is unfortunately not a recent phenomenon, and unfortunately may not be the end of, we're not seeing the end of it. So,
Thank you so much, Professor Raja and Professor Joshika, for your answers. I would also like to thank all the attendees for their participation and these wonderful questions that have been asked. Now we move on to the next segment of this webinar and discuss possible career pathways after the successful completion of an undergraduate degree in human rights. I request the panelists to share from their personal career journey what are the possible future prospects for students who wish to pursue a specialized degree in human rights. Any specific questions regarding the same can also be posted in the chat box by the attendees, and we would be happy to engage with those. Professor the attendees.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said, Apurvi, in the last sentence. Could you just repeat that, please?
Apologies, sir. I was saying that I request the panelists to share from their personal career journey what are the possible future prospects for students who wish to pursue a specialized degree in human rights. Any specific questions we will be happy to engage with from the attendees if they can leave it in the chat box. We request Professor Raja, if you could please go first and share your experience with the attendees.
Sure. Thanks, Apurvi. So I think both Joshika and I, in our presentations, talked about how different stakeholders, be it if you're talking about activists, you're talking about lawyers, you're talking about journalists, how all of them in their capacities can ensure a better actualization of human rights. So in terms of, so I'll specifically talk about a few ways in which I worked with respect to addressing human rights violations with respect to prisons and policing and legal aid. And so I'll just give a couple of examples to suggest what are the ways in which what are the ways in which you can work on, say, prison reform or access to legal aid. Now, in India, if I don't know if most of you are familiar, but majority of those who are in prison are under trial prisoners. In fact, 75%, three-fourths of the prison population are those whose trial is yet not completed. So when we talk about innocent until proven guilty, it feels a bit hollow that majority of those in custody may be acquitted later, and therefore what does it mean? So it is in that context one recognizes that those who are inside do not have quality legal representation. And in that aspect, I'll give a couple of examples of how, as a human rights practitioner, one can, what work can one do. So in Rajasthan, for example, I was working for a couple of years where I was heading a legal aid clinic. Now, in India, every individual in prison who cannot afford a lawyer has the right to a government or a legal aid lawyer. Now, while this, again, right exists, how do you actualize this? So what I did was I worked with both the prison department as well as the legal aid bodies, visited prison every week for 2 years, where what we ensured was we provided legal representation or any other advice. So prisoners had issues like they wanted to be released on parole, they had a wedding in their family and or a death in their family and they wanted to be released for some time. They wanted their bail applications and other issues. And what we did was ensure that their applications are drafted in time to be able to receive these benefits, but also developed a framework which then we gave to the state department saying, this is how you can provide legal aid in prisons, and therefore and helped the state in ensuring and implementing these rights. So this was one way of looking at work, of the ways in which a human rights practitioner can address or bridge the gap. The other example, for example, is related to what I was talking earlier about custodial violence, for example. Now, again, we recognize that while this right is a constitutional right, then any person who's arrested, who's in the police station, should have a lawyer with them when interrogation happens. Now, in practice, however, there was no framework for this. So what we did was we had consultations with different legal aid bodies in India. We also had consultations we collaborated with the UN and worked with different South Asian countries and tried to understand if they had a mechanism to provide legal aid at police stations. And then based on these consultations, based on this work, we developed a framework, worked with the legal aid bodies in India. And now currently there is a framework, though the implementation of the practice may take time, but at least there is a framework in place. So what I'm trying to say is that there are ways in which, as a human rights researcher, as a human rights activist, you can both work with the government, with government institutions to address identify critical gaps, and B, address them through research and advocacy. So that's one component. The other aspect to look at is, I was doing all of this work while working with the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Srhr, and we also recognize that prisons are opaque bodies. So we don't know, and I was talking about challenges with the quality of food, quality of health, quality of medical facilities, among others. And we recognize that the law has an oversight body, a framework where individuals like professors, lawyers, they can visit prison to identify what challenges prison face with respect to basic amenities. But again, this practice was not being followed. So we trained individuals, we worked with state institutions to get people appointed as per their qualifications, as per their criteria, train them, and then go with them inside prison to help them monitor the basic requirements that prisoners face. So therefore, there are different modes of, be it capacity building, be it research. A lot of work that I've done is to also look around data. So if we want to understand what problems exist, and to therefore, and when it's trying to address, to see if there have been changes or there have been any improvements, you need data, you need information to be able to do that. So a lot of work on human rights has also been done through RTIs, to right to information applications, where we know what the quantum of the problem is and then address it. Lastly, I also worked with the Commonwealth Secretariat. Now, this is a body which basically looks at 54 Commonwealth countries and issues relating to it. And as I was referring earlier, an important component of their work was to look at more contemporary forms of slavery. Now, how do we ensure that that these important chains or brands that we usually are accustomed to, their practices, their labor practices are not violative, that the human rights concerns with respect to their safety, their minimum pay and others are not violated, and what are the monitoring mechanisms to address this. So here with the Commonwealth, my work was to identify what the standards are. So what are gaps in the law, and also what are the gaps in practice, which can then again help the governments to identify how to address it. So most of my work, and I'm only talking about a few of them, have been necessarily at like a state level like Rajasthan, at national level for certain areas, and the Commonwealth level, where the objective is to document, to provide evidence for states to be able to implement their work better, to identify gaps so that they know what needs redressal and what needs priority. So yeah, I'll stop for now, and I think it'd be more useful to have specific questions and then to address them.
Thank you so much, Raja sir, for your valuable insight. Professor Joshika, I request you to please add your insights to the same.
Yeah, thanks, Apoorvi. Thanks, Raja. It's always nice to hear about you. Now coming to what I have done, because since we are sharing what is it that, why is it that we're here today and speaking to you about the career prospects in human rights. Now, so like I mentioned, we are lawyers by profession, and back when we were students, it was not that common. Like to be honest, like I am a first generation lawyer, and I was pretty clueless as to what is it that I really want to do. And a lot of people I know still are confused as to what is it that they are really interested in. So I had like 5 years of law school, and I was able to intern during this 5 year. And one thing that I did quite religiously is to intern at different places. Like I never had this mindset that I just want to join corporate or I just want to litigate. I did not have any idea as to what I'm going to do. So my approach was quite simple, which was to intern everywhere. So I started with trial court internships and NGOs because I was told by my professors and by quite a few of other people from the fraternity that it's always good to start from an organization which is at the very basic, because that's where you learn the most. So I have worked with quite a few NGOs. I've also worked with trial courts, and to be very honest, that's where I have learned the most. Moving on, as I started reading law and I started reading nuances about this particular field, I went on to intern at different places. Like for example, I have interned at Supreme Court with various senior lawyers. I also work with some certain civil society organizations, think tanks, on certain issues around human rights, because I was also researching while I was, doing my law. So I wasn't, since I was researching, I realized that, this is what I'm really interested in. Like human rights is the field that I'm interested in. So for human rights, I was able to work in a lot of different think tanks, which gave me an idea about how the actual work looks like apart from what was studying. I also worked with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, in India for 4 months. I worked with the Indian Ministry of Home Affairs, and that's where I worked on the rights of women and children. I also worked on prison reforms, and I worked around the rights of LGBT. So that's where it all started. Like this particular home ministry internship around human trafficking and a lot of different human rights issues really helped me understand that this human rights is what I really want to do even after, I pass out. from law school. I also worked with NDMC, which is the New Delhi Municipal Council, and I worked with the director of education there. So we were working around with NDMC schools around creating awareness. So one of you had asked this question around how can you really create awareness. So I think getting in touch with NDMC schools is a great way, because you can create such workshops. You can actually create, create these seminars and training sessions to give to students at the very, basic level. Because I feel a lot of good private schools still have like a lot of resources, but it's the NDMC schools and other schools that can actually benefit from the kind of experience that you bring to the table. So this is what I did in my 5 year of law school. But I have now realized that there are so many different programs which does not require you to do law, because to be honest, I'm not a litigating lawyer. I don't do corporate, so I'm mostly focused on human rights. So had I known that there are programs that just focus on human rights and there's no need to do law, I would have probably taken a different decision. But it is what it is. So I feel human rights as a field was something that had interested me from the very beginning, and that is what sort of shaped my entire career trajectory. Even so after I graduated from my law school, I went on to work with a high court judge. It's this law researchership that is offered to students. Like, so every judge can have 2 to 3 law researchers, and you work with them. So I was working a lot on criminal cases. So that's where, of course, human rights violation, criminal law is when I had this interest only deepened. And that's why I went to do my master's in human rights. I did a specialization in human rights. And I honestly feel that had I done a degree or a program which just focuses on human rights, as my undergraduate program, or for that matter, something that had given me an opportunity to read more about human rights before I went for my master's, that would have been great, right? Because as a lawyer, as a law student, you do study a lot of different subjects that you probably are not interested in studying, but it is what it is. So I really hope that I was able to, maybe talk about like just human rights, because that is what I was truly interested in. And even after coming back, so I worked, I've litigated for some months, and I realized this is not my cup of tea, but I worked. And that is the period when I worked on the Nirbhaya gang rape case and a couple of other cases, that dealt with women's rights, any sort of gender-based discrimination, because that is what I tend to, work around. And then I worked a lot with this one particular organization around advocacy efforts. So that is something I wanted to highlight in the earlier section when the question had happened. But now that we have this opportunity, so I'll just take 2 minutes to highlight it before we move to the questions that we have in the chat box for us. So a lot of you can actually have different prospects when you're looking at human rights specifically. So I was interested in women's rights. I still am interested in women's rights. And one thing I'm pretty clear is that I would want to create awareness, like legal awareness, right? Or like any kind of awareness related to women's rights, rights of children, and in different villages. So this is my long-term goal. Now, the idea is very simple as to how do you do this? How do you build connections? Because having a network is very important in the fields of human rights. So I personally feel that 1.5 years that I spent at that organization working as their advocacy person really helped me, because that is when we got in touch with a lot of parliamentarians, a lot of members of parliament, who we could get in touch with, in case any bill, any law came in the picture, and we wanted to like tell them that it's not okay. We have certain recommendations. These are the consultations that we've been having with different stakeholders. So this entire exercise, there's some sort of rush that happens, when you're doing something like this. So those who are not really interested in like what is there, on the paper, I think this is one of the very good idea, like one of the very good prospects that you can possibly look at. I also feel working with various organizations at the very grassroots level is something that would also help you gain a lot of idea. Like, for example, I prefer research a lot more than I prefer writing. And for me, writing is all about writing obits or pamphlets which can reach to people at large. So clinical legal education is something like that, is something that I also want to pursue in future. So this is another branch that you can look at, right? When you are trying to make a difference, like a lot of you I know would want to be a part of something that has an impact, right? A lot of you, like, because when you're young, we have all these, aspirations. So it's good to have those, but it's also good to know as to what are these various paths that one can adopt. So yeah, this is what I did. I worked with this organization for this period, and then I joined Jindal as a faculty, and I'm an assistant professor. So I'm teaching family law, and I'm teaching a couple of other subjects as well. So now, as an academic, and this was there in the previous slide that both Raja and I had in our presentation, as an academic, how is it that you can make a difference? So I think just talking to your students is something where you can really start. It's a basis of every conversation that can actually work on, that you can maybe try to create a difference, and it can go on from there to maybe coming up with a paper, coming up with certain research, or conducting certain interviews. A lot of things can happen from there on as an academic also. So you have this liberty, you have this freedom to do a lot of things when you are teaching. So I just want to highlight that it's very important to actually go on and explore than to just stick to certain notions that this is what is going to get me money, or this is what is reputed. But I think it's always good, if you're truly interested in human rights, then I think being a human rights person is going to test you at every juncture. So it's always good to be prepared by getting as much exposure as you can. And yeah, I think that would be all from my side, at least the kind of insight that I could give in regard to my career. And I would be more than happy to have any question that you might have.
If I may just add, Purvi, to what Doshika was saying, so the idea of exploration and the idea of that there are multiple possibilities if you're interested in human rights. So I'll give you an example. For example, last year, there is a journalist who's also a dear friend. She had written about the problematic caste practices that existed as a part of the jail manuals in Rajasthan. And when the article was written, it eventually then went to, there was suo moto petition in the Rajasthan High Court. And after decades of those provisions existing in the manual, it was eventually replaced. So therefore, if you're somebody who's passionate about human rights, if you recognize violations, you don't have to specifically have to be a lawyer, but as a journalist, there are important things that you can do. If you're inclined as somebody who's interested in making movies, for example, documentaries, there is so much of interesting work that can be done as somebody who looks at the lens of human rights violations and how can we address it. So the objective is to ensure that there's no one pathway when one is looking at how does one work in the human rights arena. There are different ways in which you can do that.
Thank you so much, Professor Raja and Professor Joshika. We do have one more question on the careers by Ritika. She asks, what organizations would a human rights lawyer work with? Professor Raja, if you can start. If you can go
I'm
for
sorry, could you please repeat the question again? I missed
it. Ritika asks, what organizations would a human rights lawyer work with?
Okay. I think so. Here one has to first recognize, as we have done in this webinar, that there are so many different aspects of human rights, and therefore it would be relevant. So based on your area of interest or focus, there are different organizations that work on those areas. So if you're interested in issues relating to liberty, relating to custody, organizations like Human Rights Law Network, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Lawyers Collective, amongst others, are relevant. Then there are organizations that work on disability rights, organizations that work on sexual and reproductive rights. So it really depends on your area of interest. There are different organizations that would cater to that. And then, of course, for example, the Human Rights Law Network also works on different aspects of human rights. So the answer is there's no one response to this. It really depends on what you're interested in. Joshika, do you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree with what Raja has mentioned, because since human rights is such a broad field and there are so many things that one can explore, so it's always better to see what is it that you're really interested in, like maybe just narrow it down a little, and then look at areas. There are, especially if you're from, like, say, Delhi or Bombay, there are so many different organizations that you can work with, and Raja has already named a few, and I'm sure you can explore accordingly. But it's very, very important to maybe just have 2 or 3 subheaders in your head while applying or while even looking for organizations before taking any decision whatsoever.
In fact, I'll just add saying, if you eventually narrow it down, feel free to reach out to us and we might be able to suggest organizations relevant to that.
Yeah, always on LinkedIn though.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, panelists, for the amazing answers. Well, it is great. And thank you for everyone, to whoever managed to join us today. Human rights is an important field of study, which can give you an important opportunity to not only understand the crucial rights that every human being enjoys just because they're humans, but can also equip you with the knowledge and skills required to assist and intervene when these basic rights are violated. We appreciate you all for giving us your time. Human rights is a fast-growing field of study. It offers a diverse range of career prospects, as we all have understood from this webinar. Some career prospects include academia, international and national policy making, advocacy and legal consulting, NGOs, and other international organizations. OP Jindal Global University is offering a specialized residential 3-year BA honors degree in human rights. Many interesting and fundamental courses like human rights and United Nations, child rights, social work and human rights, disability and human rights, and more form part of the curriculum. For further details regarding the same, please feel free to get in touch with the counselors of JGLS and find more information at the link circulated in the chat box. And with this, I would like to also answer Sabnam's question on what would he do after he has finished his English honors and now wants to enter this area. Well, Sabnam and all others having similar questions, we would be happy to tell you that you all can join this bachelor's degree, although undergraduate, but specializing in human rights, and carry forward with your career. It looks like we are coming to the end of the webinar. And with this, I would request Professor Anupama to please deliver a vote of thanks for our panelists and conclude today's session.
Thank you, Apurvi. On behalf of Jindal Global Law School, I offer a very hearty gratitude to the speakers for sharing their graceful words with us in today's webinar. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your journeys and providing inspiration to our audience. I would also like to thank Apurvi for moderating today's session, the IT team, admissions team, and Ms. Virangna for the efforts. And of course, I would like to extend my generous thanks to the attendees for taking out the time to attend and participate in this interesting talk. We have one more upcoming webinar on gender studies on 21st of May. You can find more information about it on our official channels, and we really hope to see some of you there as well. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.